um, basically had paused on the data upload page. They were having some trouble there. So we helped them with that, and they had kept it simple. So they wanted to make sure that the clients that were co-enrolled were similar to the clients they compared them to along gender, race, and age. And they intend in the future to make sure the groups are similar along additional variables, but for this first test run with the coach, they wanted to keep it fairly simple. So they uploaded the data, and during this TA call, they were screen sharing with us so we could see what they were doing. And the coach did the matchings to make sure that the groups that they were comparing looked similar along those three characteristics. And then did the evaluation. And what they found was that there was a 77% probability that clients who co-enrolled had higher rates of employment as of, March 22nd, like recognizing many cases are still open, than clients that had not. And so they managed to do this basically over the course of a Thursday, from Thursday mid-morning to Thursday afternoon, not continuously on the coach. So it was pretty minimal in terms of time. Obviously, Rachel and I were there to troubleshoot with them, but their plans now are to think through, how to, what else they would put in there to make it, do they want the two groups to be similar along, type of disability, whether they're receiving SSDI, SSI at application or not, other factors that might be important in their state in terms of like risk or severity of disability. And then they're going to rerun it and see. So anyway, so that is one example. It was actually, they had chosen a program, not a program, but a policy to evaluate that they thought was not going to have any impact. Whereas when I pitch the coach, I say, well, are there programs that you think are promising that you'd like rigorous evidence about? And I mentioned during the webinar, it's equally important to evaluate things that you might think are not working. And that's what they did. And they actually found, well, early evidence suggests that it's working.
Nice. So other questions that folks have, throw in the chat box, or if you want to unmute your microphone, that's fine. We don't seem to have a huge clamoring. If you want to unmute your microphone, we got to figure this out. I can even unmute mics. I can unmute the microphones of everybody if you'd like to go that route, or drop something in the chat box. Let's see. So folks are doing it themselves. Maybe other experiences. Purvi, either related to amount of time that it takes, maybe to talk a little bit about the binary piece.
Sure. So I think in terms of like, what does it take to use the coach? The first thing really is thinking about what, is there something that you want to evaluate? What is it? And I think that can be sometimes a little bit of a mental challenge. But if that's clear, really the first step then is thinking about what data you need, and assuming that you can easily extract data from your case management system and export it into something like Excel. There are some steps involved in getting the data ready for the VR coach. So currently, you would have to, upload the data through this web interface. And things like age or income, continuous variables that have like numerical meaning, the coach can use as is, but other things like if you have gender and in your case management system that's recorded as male and female, you would actually need to create binary variables. That would be, a variable that's called female, that would equal 0 or 1, or a variable called, African American, that would equal 0 or 1, as opposed to having a series of, as opposed to having one variable that had multiple values. So currently you'd have to do that on your own, and I have spoken with program evaluation staff that are really, you know, handy at doing that. And I've also talked to people who that, you know, that they don't have programming, like coding experience. And so it's kind of cumbersome. So we met with our developers, our programmers yesterday, and they are putting together something that will we'll be able to embed in the coach that will take that step out. Basically, the coach will do it for you. So we're hoping to have that, you know, ready soon. You know, I would hope within a few weeks, but that's in process. In the
So,
meantime,
oh,
you
go
know,
ahead.
in the meantime, I'll just reiterate that we are available, you know, to offer assistance and guidance if that is the bottleneck for you.
Good. Anybody have a question? Wondering about anything in particular? Have a project you're working on? Think you were thinking maybe the coach might be helpful, but you're wondering about either the analytics or the report or that type of thing? Any question? You can write it in the chat box. Again, down at the bottom, if you bring your cursor down to the bottom, that's where you'll click on the chat box. Let's see, what else may have come up? Let me, well, keep going, and then I will, except I don't know if that's going to come up on my screen. Should not. Not seeing anything. Anybody, anything, any questions from folks? I'd be interested, I know we walked through it, of those that are on the line, have you, we could sort of create a poll, but not going to do that. How many have, after the webinar, took a look at the coach if you hadn't already looked at it before the webinar, and may have been able to give a sense of how you thought it felt, sort of by felt, you know, did the question seem to make some sense? You know, if you, even if you didn't get all the way through, it might be interesting to hear from your standpoint how you thought the coach looked. So
That would be helpful.
if anybody took a look at it after the webinar, that'd be great if they wanted to share thoughts about that. Again, you could throw it in the chat, unmute your phone. That'd be great. Maybe Purvi, as folks are thinking about that, I know we had the questions that came out of that, and that's what I might go look for while you're answering the question. Other questions or other things that you've heard or had on conversations with VR agencies about their data or about getting the evaluations done or that type of thing?
Yeah, so I mean, one of the questions that came up, I know you're pulling them up, was whether there was, you know, whether the coach could be used to evaluate programs that were really small. And I just wanted to bring up again that yes, you can. There's no sample size limitation either on the lower end or the upper end. And you know, one of the reasons we developed the coach is that we wanted to reduce the burden of evaluation. And you know, at Mathematica, we do a lot of big demonstrations and evaluations, and you know, sometimes they involve like you know, 500, 600 individuals in treatment versus control. And sometimes those big evaluations are not always possible, you know, and you want to test out something small. Like, you know, if counselors approach, you know, communicate with clients, you know, in this additional way, does it increase engagement of clients, you know? And you're not going to hire someone or spend a lot of resources to evaluate whether one counselor approach is more effective than another. But something like the coach, it's free, it's easy to use. It allows you to do smaller, you know, smaller innovations, smaller tests, so that we have more evidence on what works and what doesn't work. So it doesn't have to be a big overhaul of your system. It might be something small.
Good. What I'll do is, I'm going to, for those of you, I'm not sure everybody, so we will read them, but what I'll put up on the screen, these are the questions from the webinar, and as I had mentioned, Purvi and Rachel went through and answered the questions we had. Why don't I read the question? I know that I believe we have at least one individual visually impaired, so we will read the questions, answers. We covered some of these in the webinar, but there were a number that we did not. And maybe for those of maybe I'll start with, I think, about line 19. I think I think we more or less ended with the question. Again, a piece to keep in mind that the once you upload the data, it's only in a temporary mode. When you close out of the coach, the data goes away. I mean, your file's still intact on your computer, but Mathematic isn't keeping track of your information. That was the one above, but a helpful piece to know.
Mm-hmm.
But on the multiple vendor idea, a person could have multiple studies of vendor versus no vendor. So you'd have to have 10 studies to compare the 10 vendors. Maybe a Purvi one. Well, I'll read Purvi's answer, and then if you want to elaborate on it at all.
Sure.
Yes, a user wanting to compare outcomes of 10 vendors would need to set up multiple studies comparing one vendor to another. Maybe fairly straightforward, but is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, that could be done in a number of ways. It depends on what the question is, really. If you want to see if there's any differences between the vendors, and maybe you would compare one vendor to the rest, as opposed to vendor A to vendor B to vendor C. So it really depends on what the question is. It might be that you have groups of vendors that you're comparing this group to that group, but the coach only does two-way comparisons.
Okay, all right. I think but this is actually, I think, another good question. I think you actually did answer at the webinar, but it's kind of long, but I think it may help others. Delaware VR wrote pre-employment transition service contracts to measure skills gains in the 5 core areas through pre and post test data. We did not compare it to another group who were not served. Our knowledge of eligible students age 14 to 21 enrolled in school with a documented disability is equal to about 6,300, according to the Department of Education. This is in Delaware again. Is that comparison sufficient to use as a comparison group to test skills gains and other outcomes? Maybe that's probably will come up a fair amount, particularly with those that are looking at, or some variation with pre-employment transition services. Maybe Purvi, you or Rachel, or both care to talk about that and maybe ways that the coach could take a look at that?
Sure, I'm happy to address it. So I probably would need more detail than what's here, but basically, I mean, it sounds like they're collecting great pre and post data on skill gains, and that's terrific because we don't always have that information. So, one thing that they could do is to compare youth that are receiving one or more of the pre-employment transition services to youth that are not receiving that service or any of the pre-employment transition services. And what would be required there is just that they have data on the students that are not receiving the pre-ETs. And I don't know what data agreements they have with the school districts or the Department of Education, if they have data on students with disabilities that are not receiving pre-ETs. It might be that they're just comparing students with disabilities that are already VR clients that do and don't receive pre-ETs, because there probably are some that are not receiving the 5 pre-employment transition services. So I really need to know more about how this is being implemented in Delaware and what.
Whoops, I screwed up. Sorry, Purvi, I was getting background noise.
Oh, that's okay. I was just saying that that I would need to know a little bit more about how pre-ETs was implemented in Delaware and what data they have on students, what data agreements they have with the schools, if they do have access to student data. I would assume that they don't, and so that they're relying just on VR data, in which case they might be comparing VR clients, students with disabilities that are VR clients that do and do not receive one or more of the pre-ets, and then comparing skill gains of those
Oh,
groups.
okay. So again, and I think maybe one of the pieces, and it's, at least for me, if I understand how the VR evaluation coach works, sort of what some of the traditional, and I shouldn't say traditional, kind of when you're in statistics, we either need pre or post, or we need two different groups. But if I understand the VR evaluation coach, I can create groups within. So let's say I have all of the individuals receiving pre-employment transition services, then you can say whether I'm right or wrong. I could segment them into groups. Let's say I'm interested in knowing, well, I mean, you could compare maybe 14 to 18 and 19 to 21. I mean, can that type of thing, or you could.
Yeah, you might be. Yes. So one question, there's a lot we don't know about pre-employment transition services. So for example, one of the questions I've heard people raise is like, well, what's the right age? You're not going to have a 14-year-old do, you might not have a 14-year-old engage in a work-based learning experience. You might save that for 16-year-olds and over. Maybe it's better if you wait till they're 17. Maybe it's better if you wait till they're 18. We don't know. What's the right age to begin, conversations about post-secondary? Is it in their final year? Is it in their, so you could use the coach to then say, compare and again, pre-employment transition services are just being enrolled, but compare, students that have received one or more services at this age versus that age, and then compare outcomes in terms of, do they actually enroll in post-secondary, or do they, are they employed, the year after they complete school, or, anyway, so whatever the outcome is, you could compare whether students that received the service at a particular age had better outcomes than those that received it at a different age. And again, the idea is that obviously those students are going to be different in other important ways, but the coach helps you control for that.
Great. So okay, that's nice. So again, this is, so you don't necessarily need to complete, in a sense, you don't need the old, I shouldn't say, sort of the experimental and control group. If you had one, that's great. But you can use your data to create groups, if I heard what you're saying, so to speak.
Yes. And it just depends on what you're interested in.
Yeah.
Maybe you want to evaluate your vendors. And, states have, with pre-employment transition services, our understanding from work that Rachel and I have done is, that a lot of agencies are using their existing vendors, but a lot of agencies have had to hire new vendors and come up with creative ways to, deliver these services. And you want to know who's succeeding and who isn't. And, that requires some measure of what success is, but assuming there is some information on that, you might want to compare your vendors, just as one of the earlier questions asked if you could compare 10 vendors. But so you might want to compare vendors of a particular pre-employment transition service, but that, the vendor, they might be catering to different populations. They might be serving different schools or combinations of schools, and it's not really fair to compare a vendor who might be serving a higher risk population to a vendor that's serving on average a lower risk population. So you can use the coach to then see the clients that the vendors are serving and try and identify comparable clients, that are of similar backgrounds, risk, et cetera, to do this sort of apples to apples comparison, as we like to say.
Great, thanks. Let's see, another question we have had a summer program that is getting ready to go into the 4th year. There were about 20 participants each year. The target population was limited to one type of disability in the first 2 years, but we changed the target population to include multiple disability types in years 3 and 4. Could the coach help us identify the impact of this change on a specific measure, such as satisfaction? So, and but I think this would go to Purvi's answer. Yes, the coach could help you estimate the impact of the summer program in either or both the first 2 years or subsequent years on outcomes of participants compared to similar non-participants. It'd be nice to have you elaborate a little bit on that,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe in one of the pieces that I think comes up periodically, and this is maybe a good example of that, how the coach could help in these kinds of situations where it's not a static kind of fidelity situation where exactly what this individual's described. The first couple of years we're serving these types of clients or doing this type of thing, and then in years 3 and 4 it gets expanded. So maybe a good answer, but maybe talk again about how the coach can help folks understand when the methodology, not the methodology, but when the service is kind of evolving over time.
Sure.
And not to make it, but how to maybe help with that, or how to help folks think about that.
Mm-hmm. So I could see that this individual or agency might have several questions related to this program and its expansion. So one question might be, was customer satisfaction any different when it was expanded than when it was smaller? And I don't know if that was the question that they were getting at. And then you would set up an evaluation in the coach to compare consumer satisfaction measures of participants in the early years to participants in the latter years. And then again, you would use the coach to try and, be comparing satisfaction among groups of participants that are similar. So in years 3 and 4, you've got individuals with multiple types of disabilities. And in years 1 and 2, you just have individuals with a single type of disability. Well, if satisfaction differs in years 1 and 2 to 3 and 4, maybe it's because of that, right? But maybe it's because there are important differences between the participants. So then what the coach might do is say, well, let's match on type of disability, and maybe we're just going to compare consumer satisfaction among individuals with that disability that all the participants had that disability in years 1 and 2, if that makes sense.
Okay, so you might match a group if the disability was, let's say, mental health, serious mental illness, however you want to look at it. One example could be you would match, even if you were picking in multiple disability types in years 3 and 4, you might just single out the mental health clients in years 3 and 4 to see, and I suppose then you could look at, you could match on that group, but if the mental health patients in the years 3 and 4 showed higher satisfaction,
exactly.
Some other pieces you could take a look at, but it kind of gives you a pretty good idea that if pretty much the only thing you did was to either change the program or something, but at least it tells you that there was a change. Okay.
Right.
Cool.
Seems like we have 2 questions from the audience.
You can see them, Purvi, so why don't you just go ahead.
Sure. So Angel Bryant, who's from GVRA, is that Georgia VR?
Yes.
Okay, great. Asking, as part of a recent monitoring review, RSA would like them to monitor appropriateness of services. How would one measure this? Great question. Maybe that's a question for RSA. So I'm not sure. I mean, I could try and guess what RSA is getting at, but I'm not sure. So, is it whether services, the appropriate services are authorized for the right, for the appropriate clients, meaning to what extent are services targeted properly? And if that is what they were getting at, I think like appropriate in this context is, well, does the service work? And so thinking about what's the intended outcome of the service, and then looking at the data to see to what extent does this service result in the intended outcome. And what I would then do is probably, and I would need more context, and you probably have, understanding of the service and the programs, but, are there groups that you think might be getting the service that shouldn't be getting it? Or are there groups that some people think shouldn't be getting the service but are getting it? Is it overly or inappropriately authorized? In that case, I would then use the coach again to look at outcomes for those subgroups to see, okay, you know what? Job placement services seem to be effective for many people, but for this subgroup, it doesn't seem to be working, and maybe it's not appropriate. Anyway, so I think that I need more context, but
Yeah.
I'd be happy to talk to you about that. Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah. And then Warren's question.
Sure. And then Angel, if you have a follow-up, just feel free to speak up or to type in the chat. But I'm going to read Warren's question. Warren G, are there any plans to have the ability to upload the RSA 911 files and run some canned report comparisons? That is a really good question. And so basically, could we, if you downloaded, as you do, you get your 911 reports ready to send to RSA, and the format of all of those measures is standardized. And so we could certainly come up with some canned report comparisons. The question is always like, is it useful? So if you were to tell us, I mean, I think we would be happy to do something like this, but I think it would require some conversations with folks like you to see what things would you want to see in these reports. What services, what comparisons would be useful, because there's even just with the not so limited but still limited number of measures in the RSA 911, there'd be like an infinite set of things we could do, and we would want to make sure that what we produce in terms of the canned reports is what's going to be the most useful. So follow-up question from Angel is that yes, we will have a follow-up discussion. So Angel, why don't you get in touch with me, and I can also get in touch with you if we have your email.
Actually, we do. We have Angel's email, so
okay,
we
great.
we can get that to you. And Angel, if you'd like to also send it to either myself, Terry, or to Purvi, we will get you two together, or three, however many, 4, 5, 6, however many there are. Any other questions? Oh, did somebody? Oh, I guess not. Just kicked up. Warren, if you're still on, this isn't like holding, again, not holding you to it, but did you in your head have a sense of some canned report, as we'd say, canned reports comparisons? Either, and again, it might be similar to, in some ways, from a monitoring visit, and even regular questions you might get. This could be a combination of regular questions folks may get from constituents, advocates, legislators, that type of thing, to Purvi's piece. But that's been an idea that I talk a good game. I haven't been able to figure out yet. Yeah. And the coach might be a way to do this is for individuals who, again, the coach is meant to ease the time, shorten the time of doing evaluations. Can we figure out a way to also shorten the time of being able to get some informative information from your 9/11 data? Oh, okay. Scroll up so we can read previous questions. Oh, okay. I can do that. And we will send this out to everybody that attended the webinar. Well, yeah, we can go through these again. Mm-hmm. But does the tool allow you to save different clients under your login? And can you recall each client at a later time? And Purvi's answer.
I wasn't sure I understood the question correctly.
Yeah.
So, so a couple things. You know, you can have multiple people use the same login if you're just trying to, have one of your staff members use the same login. That would be fine. I didn't think that was what the Stacy was asking, but I just wanted to put that in case it was. But the coach does allow you to create and save multiple evaluations under an individual login. And then the evaluation can include as few or as many clients, students, school districts, et cetera, as you want. But each of these individual groups must be identified either as being part of this treatment group or comparison group. And so, and then I also wanted to address this question of recall. Like, again, the data isn't stored in memory. You upload it and it's analyzed right away, and then it's erased from memory. But you can then redo the analysis if you have, let's say you run an analysis in March comparing, clients that received a particular service to those that didn't. And then you want to rerun that same analysis in September. That's fine. Everything would be set up, all the questions. You just upload a new set of data and you'd get a new set of results. So you could set up evaluations that you ran every 3 months or every 6 months or occasionally with updated data.
And that, as you were mentioning that, Purvi, and you may have said during the webinar, how long, I know it's just getting started in your sense, so if somebody is using this fairly actively 2-3 times a year, assuming it goes on, about how, have you talked about how long the reports and those types of things would remain in somebody's login? And, is it?
Mm-hmm. The report is saved, the data is erased. We don't have any plans to erase the reports from there.
Okay,
yeah.
So they'll be there as long as the eval coach is. Great.
Yes. Yeah.
That's actually kind of handy in some ways. If I think of turnover in any organization, and sometimes you have to sort through people's files to find things, and depending what the VR, all you have to have is a login, and you can track it down. Realizing it is a weaker design, does it, the coach, does it provide support for one group design?
The coach does not provide support for one group design. It requires the use of 2 groups. But I just wanted to make this note that even if you think that everyone received a service, usually, there's going to be someone that didn't. And so it might just be that that if we spend a little time talking about it, we can think about how to turn a one group into a 2 group thing. You have one group that is taking part in something, and if you want to really know if it's making a difference, you want to know if it's making a difference compared to if they didn't take part in it. And so we find a group that didn't. So it's usually possible to find an alternative group.
I think, let's see, question 5, line 15 was about vendors, and I think we've talked about that one. Why don't, question 4 on line 14 of the Excel spreadsheet, again, talks about security of the information, de-identifying. We've talked about it a few times, but helpful to, I think, keep talking about it. If a good description there, but if there's, maybe walk through that, and maybe some other questions might come up from folks.
Yep. Yeah. So I do have a URL in there that has the full privacy policy, which is not just about data security, but also other issues of privacy. But the website is hosted on Amazon's Gov Cloud, and we picked this because of its security. There's more information about their environment on their website, and we have information about it in our privacy policy. We basically implemented measures designed to secure the information from accidental loss and from unauthorized access, use, alteration, or disclosure. And we selected this hosting provider because they have implemented network level safety security measures that are considered best practice standards in the industry. So there you have it. If there are follow-up questions to that, please, feel free to post them. But there is quite a bit of information in that privacy policy. You don't need to log into the coach to access the links that I've included in some of these answers. You can just copy and paste them.
Okay. Let's see, we talked about vendors. The closed caption. Maybe, let's see, we had regressions, questions. I'm trying to think. Seems like, let's see. Yeah, and then just, so the assumptions about regression tested non-normality does not test assumptions of normality, nor does it make corrections for it. So that may be a piece that is useful to understand.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot that the coach does that's handy in terms of this matching tool. However, it's using a fairly straightforward approach. And so it's not, while we think it's sophisticated in some ways, it's not allowing for, super high level analyses that are going to, make adjustments for an amount. Like just at that level, you would need to use a, statistical software that was not kind of this web interface, but just a standard, more traditional statistical software.
Great, thanks. Again, I don't, we're coming at it a couple of different ways, but again, the question 8, line 18, about when you don't have a lot of participants in a particular program or possibly some services you want to take a look at. Again, talk through that and talk through size and maybe talk a little bit about, again, the picking the confidence level. So,
Sure. Yeah, there was another sample size question, I think earlier in there, and I think my answer to that was probably a little bit more clear or accurate. But basically, there's no minimum sample size requirement. However, the larger the sample you have, the more likely it is that if indeed the program is effective, that the coach will be able to detect it, if that makes sense. So if you have a small sample, let's say you have a sample of 10, and 5 clients participated in a program and 5 clients did not. But you're just looking at 10 clients. And of the 5 clients that did participate in a program, 4 had successful closure outcomes, let's say. And of those that didn't participate in a program, 3 had successful closure outcomes. So you'd see that there was 1 more in the service group that closed successfully than in the non-service group. But are you confident in saying that that's, because of the service? It's like such a small difference. And so it might really be that it was due to that program, but that sample size is so small that the coach would not, or any statistical program, would not be able to say with any level of confidence that, with any reasonable level of confidence, that the participants of the program had greater success than non-participants. So I'm just using that as an extreme example. So the larger the sample, the more likely it is that the coach would find an effect when there was one, given whatever level of confidence you set. You can always lower the level of confidence to, because that's a parameter that the coach allows you to set. So you might know, like, well, I'm testing a small program, there are only 20 participants, and I'm comparing them to, 50 clients that didn't participate. And I don't need to be 100% sure that differences between the 2 groups are due to this program. But if there was a 75% chance that the program had an impact on their outcomes, I would be comfortable enough making the claim that this program was effective. So you can set that level. And so if you have a big sample, you can keep that confidence level pretty high. Anyway, so it's sort of a trade-off between sample size and confidence and all of that.
Actually, thinking of that, let's say I have a large, maybe I'm looking at 3,000 cases as a number, and that's probably enough to go to a higher confidence level. But let's say, let's say but I know that in my state or my program or my organization, sort of to your earlier point, oftentimes we feel like we're flipping a coin, so that if I can get a 75%, that this is probably happening, that's pretty good. So if I picked 75 as my parameter and I'm with a VR program and I run the coach, does it does it does it just say yes or no you hit 75, or I don't recall, or does it say you're actually at 93?
It tells you.
Oh,
It
okay.
says, yeah, it at the end in that findings brief that the coach produces at the end of the evaluation, it will say, okay, there is a 83% chance that this summer program, um, uh, you know, increased, that youth that participated in the summer program had higher graduation rates than youth that did not participate in this program. It'll tell you what that
Okay.
probability is. Yeah.
Oh, great. So if I pick 75, it'll tell me that it's actually at 85
Yes.
versus just a yes, no. You were
Yes.
okay. Helpful to
And
know.
yeah, and we really want that to be in the hands of the user.
Yeah.
So we're not going to give you a yes or no. I mean, you set that threshold at the beginning and you can always go back and change it. Um, but we're not saying you need to meet a 95% level of confidence or anything. We recognize that a lot of these, um, you know, there's new programs that are being tested or not tested, but that are being, authorized, implemented, and we want, agencies want some information, evidence on whether they seem promising or not. And so while, maybe to get statewide implementation of something, you might need really strong evidence. It might be that, in order to know if you should scale it up next summer to 2 schools instead of the 1, 65, 75% confidence might be encouraging enough that you want to keep scaling it up and keep evaluating it.
Oh, yep. Oh, that's great. And the same I think is true. If I said 75, it's going to tell me that it's only 45, correct? I mean,
Yeah.
it gives me a number, sort of.
Yeah.
I mean, I said something so I have an idea, but it will give me the actual
Yeah.
percentage.
If you set a threshold of 75% and it says that there's a 45% chance that this program had the intended effect, then it's basically saying there is a 55% chance that the program did not have the intended effect. And so the findings report starts by saying, this program, and it'll name the program, did not have the intended effect on whatever the outcome was, and then it'll tell you,
Tell you what
the
okay.
percentages are. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, that's handy. I think we've covered all the questions we had received at the webinar in one way, shape, or form. I'm not seeing any additional questions on the chat, so I think we could probably wrap this up. Again, encourage you, or I say this because I won't get the questions, but Purvi, you and Rachel are still comfortable with people sending you questions, either about the coach or maybe sort of related to they want to use the coach, but they need a little bit of help thinking through some initial questions, that type of thing. And I'll put this out there. I say the royal we again, partly because Piqua is co-sponsoring this. Well, many of us, but Piqua and Mathematica. If you are interested and have a project in mind or kind of an idea of a project in mind, and would like some intensive technical assistance with Purvi and Rachel, and I suspect they can pull in some other folks on it, as well as those of us at Piqua, let us know. We want to test. I mean, clearly, Mathematica has been testing the coach. We're interested from a Piqua standpoint of better understanding the coach and how it's meeting the needs, or not, in what areas it may not be meeting the needs. Nothing meets everything. But again, if you have a project in mind, if you have something that you really wanted to take a look at, but you're feeling you may not have all the time to do it yourself, but you think the coach might, get in touch with us. Get in touch with Purvi and Rachel, and we can help you work through it and essentially pick up some of the load of working through that by particularly Purvi and Rachel, of their understanding of the coach, to get a project evaluated that you've been thinking about for a while but haven't have thought, I don't have time to set up the whole evaluation design on my own. I don't have time to sort through it. I'm not exactly sure if I'm clear on all the questions I need to ask. We can do this together. So if you're interested in some intensive TA to use the coach around a project, please let us know. But again, even some, without getting too far afield, but if this has prompted a couple questions about a couple things you're taking a look at, sure. But at least those of you that particularly came on the Q&A, yeah, drop Purvi or Rachel a question saying, I'm thinking to take a look at it, but am I way off the mark on how I'm thinking about doing this? That no matter what responses I get, it won't mean anything because of how I structured it. Those are always some of those kinds of questions. Purvi, anything you'd like to add?
No, thanks so much to everyone for participating today and last week. And as Terry said, feel free if you're more comfortable emailing to email me questions.
And we may follow up. Warren, and many of you probably saw it, that not exactly sure on the canned reports yet because there's the question of RSA monitoring and what exactly they may want. But it is a piece we will keep talking about, maybe query a few of you on even what you think might be some initial pieces just to see how it might look or if we can do it. To again, I think from Warren's standpoint and from many people, are we able to take our quarterly 9/11 data, upload it, fix it, so not fix it, make it uploadable, and be able to get some things, are we able to get some reports every quarter that we could use, and then progressively use that to start taking an ongoing look. And the canned report could be sort of a canned evaluation report. Are we getting better at certain kinds of things? Although you could do that once you set it up. So anyway, that conversation will continue. Thanks very much, everybody. We will be figuring out, based on this webinar, based on questions, based on a couple other things, we're hoping to do a couple more webinars, maybe the old deeper dive into the coach, or we'll figure out a variety of things, maybe some advanced uses of the coach, that type of thing. So thanks very much. Like I said, we recorded this. Once we transcribe it into a format that everybody can take a look at, we'll be posting this on the webpage along with the original webinar. We will get the questions. We'll put the answers to these questions probably in a Word document or a PDF, get these out to everybody that attended the webinar, and the couple of extra questions we had. And thanks again. So that's really about it.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.